Welcome all, and thank you for joining us today for this presentation on the PRIF study on labor trafficking among agricultural workers in Brazil. I am Dr. Lydia Letares. I'm the Associate Director at the Center on Human Trafficking Research and Outreach at the University of Georgia and the coordinator of the PRIF, the Prevalence Reduction Innovation Forum. Without further ado, I'd like to give our speakers a very warm welcome. We have Ms. Jessie Brunner and Dr. Kim Babiarz from the Stanford Human Trafficking Data Lab presenting today. I believe also the principal investigator, Dr. Grant Miller, is with us today. And we will have a Q&A session after their presentation. So please use the Q&A function to ask any questions, and our speakers will address them after their main presentation. Thanks again for being here, everyone. Jessie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lydia and Andre, for all the support in the background and the whole center team for putting this together and putting in place some additional precautions, and to you all for coming and bearing with us a second time to present this work. So as Lydia mentioned, I'm Jessie Brunner, and I'll be doing a quick overview of the lab before Kim digs into some of the results. If you can advance the slide, please, Kim. Thank you. So we're representing the Stanford Human Trafficking Data Lab. This is a sort of subset of our core group in the lab, and we've certainly been growing over the years since we got started about 5 years ago at Stanford. But we're a multidisciplinary team that brings both academic expertise and significant frontline anti-trafficking experience into this work, really focused on bringing promising innovations in research methods and modern data science into the fight against human trafficking. And I'm sure many of you noted that this year's recently released TIP report did have a feature on sort of the uses of technology, both in perpetuating trafficking, but more relevant to our work in combating it. And so it's exciting to see that those efforts being highlighted by JTIP, who of course we want to also thank for their support of the PRIF project and enabling this work. So our team got started really motivated by the stated needs that we were hearing from frontline anti-trafficking actors. Notably, Luis Assis, our partner here in the middle of that photo, which is pertinent because he really is sort of the heart of our work, and really wanting to develop tools that can actually support folks working at the front lines in Brazil in their anti-trafficking efforts. Also wanting to highlight that obviously prevalence is a piece of our work, and that's what we're going to be speaking about today. But really we're motivated to understand sort of the broader social, economic, and political drivers of trafficking, as well as its impacts. So yeah, that's we have a holistic suite of projects that hopefully we'll have further opportunities to talk about with you all in the future. Something that's really important to us relatedly is really ensuring that we have a robust understanding of the operating environment before we get started on any new project. And this is where our partnerships really come in key. So, in addition to Luis, we work with a number of Brazilian government agencies that are involved in sort of the national referral mechanism for trafficking cases. We also have a broader team of academic experts involved in our work from other universities beyond Stanford. We have a lot of civil society engagement, both at the international level, partnerships with GFEMs and the like, but also locally in Brazil. Several of whom are key to our projects. And then, of course, we're grateful to our wonderful supporters who have enabled us to get this far. And just to emphasize that we really do involve local stakeholders in the design and execution of all of our projects, as well as students, because we obviously have a strong commitment to education and learning being based at Stanford. Next slide, please. So in terms of our motivation, I imagine many of you have seen headlines like these, some very recently. The winery case there that's featured in the middle, I think, got a lot of play within the last year. And this case involved more than 200 people working in the southern region of Brazil, supplying some of the largest wineries actually in the country And after a few workers were able to get to a local police station to ask for help and share with investigators, the experiences that they'd had working very long hours, being surveilled by armed guards, suffering physical abuse, not receiving payment, etc. That really opened up this large case, just as an example of one of many. And this was, cases like these were a large part of our motivation in wanting to really look at labor trafficking in the Brazilian agricultural space in particular. We're also working on another project, again, with GFEMS, funded by JTIP, looking at the prevalence, sorry, not the prevalence, looking at the incidence of trafficking in the coffee sector. So we are broadly looking at agriculture as a key focus area. And just wanting to highlight that obviously, Brazil being a key economic powerhouse in the region, we're bound to find, higher incidence of trafficking there. But also that, anytime you see, I think a lot of cases, that also demonstrates a strong commitment from the government in many cases to looking for the problem. And so we found Brazil a great place to work in terms of there being a strong bipartisan governmental commitment to the issue, as well as a commitment to strong data keeping, which has been key to our learnings. Next slide, please. So as I sort of highlighted, agriculture is the most common sector where we find detected cases of trafficking, noting the word detected being key there. This early partnership with the Brazilian Federal Labor Prosecution Office was what sort of enabled this understanding. And we were able to see that about 38% of documented cases were occurring in cattle ranching, 27% in sugarcane production, and 22% in rice cultivation, with trafficking issues well documented in other sectors like tea, cocoa, and coffee. And despite a lot of 15 years of committed anti-trafficking work by the government, there's still sort of a lack of knowledge around the true prevalence and nature of the issue of forced labor in Brazilian agricultural, which obviously is going to have impacts on intervention. And so that really motivated our interest in getting involved. Also highlighting that over 50% of those firms listed on Brazil's dirty list are tied to the agricultural sector. So this was also a strong motivation for us. Obviously highlighting that detected cases don't necessarily indicate prevalence, and there's biases involved in that kind of detection of unknown magnitude and direction. And so it was exciting to have an opportunity to provide a more representative prevalence estimate. And obviously, even those existing data cannot highlight for us the what sort of underscores this type of exploitation and risk factors, and the sort of demographic profile of workers. So that was something else that we're able to pull out of this study. Next slide, please. And so these are our overall objectives with this work. So obviously understanding the prevalence of human trafficking in the agricultural sector, using a gold standard representative household survey in 4 states, which Kim will go into more details on. Those states with the highest proportion of agricultural workers. We wanted to estimate the relative prevalence of specific practices. So this is where the PRIF indicators really come into play. And then compare those results to the prevalence numbers generated by a NSUM method. We also aim to understand sort of the risk profile of workers within this sector, and particularly across subsectors. So looking at different subsectors of agriculture to understand what risk factors we see, what indicators are more prevalent, et cetera. And then to really dig into the policy implications of this. So being able to compare the cases we find through the survey to our known suite of detected cases and those that have been prosecuted. And we'll dig in more a little bit later around the policy implications of that. And I will now hand it over to Kim to get us started on the results.
Thanks very much, Jessie. That was a really great introduction and nice overview of our objectives in completing this survey. As Jessie mentioned, our main goals are to understand sort of a representative picture of trafficking, not only prevalence, but what does trafficking look like and what does the experience of agricultural workers in Brazil look like generally. We selected 4 states for our study, and we selected the states with the highest proportion of workers in agriculture. So important to note that because we want a population representative study, what we did is, we are sort of going to go out and do this household survey and try to find and identify households that have agricultural workers or that are engaged in agriculture work. So we felt it was important to select the states that had the highest concentration of workers that are engaged in agricultural work. So we selected those 4 states: Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí, and Bahia. Within those states, we then selected 18 municipalities, and we stratified on the sort of jurisdiction of trafficking, anti-trafficking law enforcement bodies. So the way that Brazil addresses trafficking in the country is through sort of this joint effort between labor inspectors and labor prosecutors, and they sort of divide the country into a number of different jurisdictions. And so we sort of stratified on those jurisdictions because trafficking enforcement may be different, across those jurisdictions. Within those 18 municipalities, we then selected 210 study clusters, which were actual census enumeration units. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we had to rely on the 2010 census, since at the time the 2020 or 2022 census, as it were, hadn't been released yet as we're drawing our study cluster. Okay, we went to each of those census units, and we completed a household survey or a listing of all of the households that were living there to identify which ones were in agriculture. And then we sampled in real time until a maximum of 35 households per study cluster were included. We used 2 methods to estimate trafficking among the agricultural population in our study area. First method is a population representative household survey. As I mentioned, we wound up having a total of more than 10,000 agricultural workers that were identified in over 7,000 households. What we found is that 43% of workers, only 43% of agricultural workers that we identified were actually working on farms that were not owned by family members. So this is an important dynamic in a sector like agriculture, where you have a very large percentage of people who are actually working for themselves or are working, for family members or sort of, for people that they're related to or whatever. And although the trafficking indicators become more complicated when you think about a dynamic like that, we still have to factor them in when we're thinking about computing an overall prevalence in the whole sector. So among the people who were working on farms that were not owned by family members, we asked workers to complete a detailed work history to assess trafficking experiences. One of the pieces that we conditioned on is that they had to have completed a job spell within the previous 2 years, I think, in order to sort of minimize recall bias and to understand the complete experience of the job. The second method we used was network scale up. We collected network data among a total of 2,085 agricultural workers in our same sample. We chose alter groups defined by the most common first names for both men and women, and we selected the most common name in each 10-year age group to get a complete distribution of the population. And then we, in order to ask people about the trafficking experience of people in their networks, we focused on the most commonly occurring trafficking indicators, which in themselves would be sufficient to define trafficking. But we think that there are other adjustments that we'll need to make in the future to include sort of the conditional probability of also experiencing other indicators. Okay, so let's move on to the results. As I mentioned, in a sector like agriculture, you have a number of households that are working for themselves, for their family, for their parents, whatever, for their children even. And those we consider, like, we term them family agriculture, or, and then we distinguish those from hired agricultural workers, who are workers that are hired for people that are not related to them. We compute prevalence among both of those groups, and we think that that's important because if we're thinking about the entire agricultural sector as it's reported in, like, labor surveys, for example, you want to take into account everybody working in that sector. So our population, our PPS estimates come out to about 1.62% of the entire agricultural sector, or 4.9% of the subset of agricultural workers who are hired agricultural workers, meeting either threshold 1 or 2, which are sort of those are the core indicators. I think we're sort of short on time, so I'm just gonna quickly say that we also collected information about the full, I think, 35 of the indicators of trafficking, so including a lot of those medium indicators, which are needed in sort of like 3 medium indicators plus 1 strong indicator to meet threshold 3 definition of trafficking. If we include those medium indicators, of course, we get a much higher prevalence of trafficking of 5.4% in the entire agricultural sector, or actually 18% among hired agricultural workers. Not quite, maybe I should just take a second to explain the thresholds. I kind of brushed over it because I think everybody in the PRIF learning series is using the same threshold, but maybe it's worth just taking a second to go over those. The PRIF indicator structure provides for 3 different thresholds of trafficking determination. The first threshold being extremely severe, or like sort of the most egregious indicators of trafficking. Threshold 2 includes a set of 12 different core indicators of trafficking across a number of different domains of employment conditions. And in order to be considered a trafficking victim, you need to either meet any of the threshold 1 definitions, which are quite severe, or 2 of the 12 indicators that are included in threshold 2. Then there are a number of other exploitative practices, which are also, sort of terrible for workers to experience, but maybe less severe than the threshold 1 or 2 indicators. Those are the medium indicators. And in order to meet a definition of trafficking, we need to observe at least 3 of the medium indicators plus 1 strong indicator of trafficking. Hopefully that's clear as mud. Okay. So our network scale-up results are largely consistent with the PPS estimates. We wound up, as I mentioned, selecting alter groups to represent from the most common first names observed among people in different age demographics. And when we looked across the population, we found that our alter groups selected represent between 10 and 38% of the population in each age group by sex. So we feel very confident that that's a very robust, that enables a very robust computation of an NSUM, of a representative NSUM result. The average implied network size of respondents was 58 agricultural workers, and the implied NSUM estimate of trafficking among hired agricultural workers was 3.05%. So definitely within the confidence interval of our PPS estimate, although a little bit lower. Okay, so what does trafficking look like for those who are considered trafficking survivors? And I will just mention that from here on out, what we're only going to be talking about hired agricultural workers. So we did compute prevalence, including the entire agricultural sector, including family agriculture, but going forward, we're really just going to focus on the experience of hired agricultural workers, as it relates to all the different indicators and the sort of the demographics and the profile of victims of trafficking. Okay, so we found that among those who were trafficked, by far the most common means by which people are trafficked are through debt, high and increasing debt to the employers, deceptive recruiting, and pay being withheld and used to prevent workers from leaving their jobs. We also saw quite a lot of control over employees' personal lives, surveillance and coercive recruitment, and then the other indicators with a lower prevalence. Notably, we didn't see a very high prevalence of violence, which is fortunate for the agricultural workers, but generally what this tells us is that sort of this pay being used to prevent workers from leaving their jobs, almost being like held by the fact that you're not going to get paid unless you complete the job or the season for the employer. Deceptive recruitment about the nature of the job or the location of the job, and this accumulating debt that goes to the employer. And just qualitatively, what we've learned is that debt is generally connected to transportation to and from the job, housing on the job, meals, and that kind of thing that the employees need to have. Interestingly, when we consider all higher agricultural workers, whether or not they met the definition of trafficking, we still find that quite a lot of workers experience at least many of these indicators, right? 17% of agricultural workers had their pay withheld and used to prevent them from leaving their jobs. So this is a dynamic that we have been hearing over and over again, where workers will go to a job for a season, picking coffee or whatever, and they don't get paid until they complete the season or they complete the job contract. And if they walk away, they lose all of their money, right? We also found a relatively high percentage of all agricultural workers reporting that the recruitment was deceptive, reporting debt to their employers as well. We found that a shocking number of agricultural workers were experiencing at least one indicator of trafficking, at least one or two or more exploitative practices that sort of fall under the umbrella of trafficking indicators. In fact, over 95% of workers experienced at least one indicator, including those medium indicators of trafficking, and 78% experienced two or more. And I understand that, the medium indicators include some practices that are exploitative, but quite common. So even if we just focus on the strong indicators of trafficking, which should not be common and are incredibly exploitative, we found that 30% of workers of hired agricultural workers experienced at least one of those strong indicators of trafficking, which is quite alarming. Okay, so we made this figure to kind of illustrate or visualize for you sort of the extent to which these indicators are experienced. You can see that by far the largest number of people are experiencing these exploitative employment practices. That includes the pay being withheld and the debt incurred to the employer, as well as deceptive recruitment being another very large percentage of trafficking indicators that are experienced. And this figure kind of visualizes the extent to which these indicators are experienced together. And sort of in the middle here, you can see some people who are experiencing almost all of the indicators of trafficking over and over again. Okay. Let's turn now to a profile of trafficked workers. What we found is that trafficked workers are generally more likely to be male and Black or multiracial when compared to the overall population percentage. And also they're slightly sort of younger than the typical agricultural workers. Interestingly, we find that literacy is sort of a little bit of a confusing result. We found that relatively few victims of trafficking that were identified in our survey reported being illiterate, and sort of no difference in the literacy rate across trafficked and not trafficked individuals. We did find, as I mentioned just now, a pretty big discrepancy in the racial makeup of victims of trafficking compared to those agricultural workers who were not trafficked, with more workers who are classified as Black as opposed to multiracial or white, fewer white agricultural workers being trafficked. This slide shows information about where the workers are working in the agricultural sector generally, and also among those who are trafficked, as well as how they're being recruited and the different types of contracts they're experiencing. And we found some pretty surprising and compelling results here. What we found is that almost 2/3 of people who were meeting the definition of trafficking under threshold 1 or 2 actually were working quite close to home. So we found that 66% of trafficked workers were working locally. So not even within, and then another 20% were working not necessarily locally, but within the same municipality that they currently resided in. Only 5% were working outside of their home municipality, and only 3% were working in a different state. So this is a pretty interesting result for us, and really challenges us to think about the experiences of workers who may not be considered by law enforcement or other sort of other definitions, because they are actually people can be trafficked close to home, right? And if you think about like a task force going into an area and looking at workers who are, maybe migrants from other states versus workers who are local, a lot of times we see in those inspections that those workers are separated into two groups, and one is sort of treated as trafficking if they've been brought in from outside. The others who are sort of local to the area are not considered trafficking victims. So that's a pretty interesting result, and I think one that is really telling about the experiences of workers even when they're working close to home. We found that very few agricultural workers were actually using third-party recruiters, which was also surprising to us because we expected to find many more third-party recruiters. Most of them were being recruited either through an acquaintance, a friend, or a family member, or actually just directly by the farm owner themselves. We found that, of course, most of the agricultural workers, both those who were not trafficked and trafficked, had no contract at all. Many of them had only verbal contracts or sort of these indefinite contracts, and very few of them had actual sort of work contract written out. Okay, when we look at the different sectors of agriculture where we found trafficking, the most common sectors among those who are considered trafficked were coffee, cocoa, and beef cattle. Coffee and cattle, not surprising. Actually, those are very large, like a percentage of the agricultural sector generally. So it's like proportionally, it's about the same, right? So you're not particularly at risk in cocoa, or in coffee. It's just that there's quite a lot of coffee workers in Brazil. So yeah, 27% of trafficked workers were in the coffee sector, compared to 36% who were not trafficked, and a similar sort of equivalent dynamic, 24% in beef cattle and 22% who were trafficked and 22% who were not trafficked. One interesting result that we found here is that is in the cocoa sector. So cocoa is a very, I think we hear a lot of anecdotes about trafficking in the cocoa sector, and I think it's sort of commonly accepted to be a particular, like a risky sector, but we don't actually see a lot of cocoa in prosecuted cases in Brazil. If we look at the corpus of cases that have been processed through the legal system in Brazil, very few of them occur in the cocoa sector. And we found only 8% of all agricultural workers working in cocoa, but 25% of the trafficked workers were in the cocoa sector. So that suggests that maybe there is some aspect of cocoa work here that is particularly risky, or maybe undercounted or maybe underrepresented in the detected cases that we have, or the cases that go through sort of the law enforcement process. So maybe a sector that deserves a little bit more attention, either like policy-wise, or maybe a more detailed look in the future to understand why is it more risky than other sectors. Okay. I kind of already talked about this, so I'll just go through quickly. Cocoa stands out as a particularly risky subsector. And again, it's not frequently represented in the corpus of detected and prosecuted cases. In fact, less than 1% of workers rescued from trafficking by law enforcement in Brazil since 1996 were producing cocoa when they were rescued. Another dynamic that I think that our team thinks has a lot of policy implications is the large percentage of local workers who sort of were experiencing these extremely exploitative practices that amounted to trafficking. Yeah, 87% of trafficked workers were actually working in the same town or the same municipality, and just 3% were working out of state. And those migrant workers typically get a lot of attention, and indeed in the if you look at the body of prosecuted cases in the past in Brazil, a vast majority of those are migrant, either from a different state or from a different municipality within the same state. But I think it's worth considering for policymakers to think about the exploitative practices that are happening even close to home, that people are just enduring on the day-to-day basis as a sort of seemingly regular part of agricultural work in Brazil. Okay. Jessie, is this you again, or should I keep going?
This is you until slide 21.
Okay. I don't see the slide numbers, so you'll have to tell me when it's time for you again. Okay, so what did we find? What, sort of how did we learn from our experience doing this survey in Brazil? We had a number of really incredible partnerships with local organizations and collaborators in Brazil, and we learned quite a lot from their expertise, and we, I think our study benefited quite a lot from their experience as well. This is what you see here is a group of people who run the enumeration company that we use to enumerate our survey. It's called Science, and based out of Rio. And these individuals are sort of veterans of the National Statistics Agency in Brazil. They care a lot about Brazil, and they were extremely invested in helping us think through not only how to really achieve a representative sample of Brazilian agricultural households, but also how to approach trafficking in a culturally relevant context, how to modify the questions in a way that sort of felt appropriate for the context, and also, thinking through the ethics of, what do we do with the information that we're collecting from people? What happens if we, determine that somebody has been trafficked after the survey is done, right? So they did a wonderful job. They were incredible partners, and we think that our study was much better from working with them and sort of talking together and exchanging about, what actually does trafficking look like? What does it mean to have these indicators, and how do we operationalize them in a survey context? And these are some pictures of the field enumeration teams that were located in each of the states. Okay, so yeah, I think this is a picture of another, oh, this is Diana. Okay, so this is sort of a policy implication. Okay, so what do we do with this information after we collect it, having this rigorous, statistically representative estimate of the not only the prevalence of trafficking, but also the particular experiences of agricultural workers that contribute to trafficking, is critical for helping to improve the way that civil society and the social safety net, the various civil servants who are administering social safety net programs, handle trafficking cases after the fact, right? So there's a lot of focus on these task forces that will go in and identify trafficking and sort of prosecute the cases and whatever, but then what happens to the individuals after the fact? And so, what we have done is worked closely with some partners in one of our states, our target states, which is Maranhão, to implement a case management system, which sort of will regularize and formalize the process of post-trafficking care to the survivors of trafficking. And the way that we have incorporated the findings from our survey into that is actually we have helped them to modify the needs assessment questionnaire that's administered through the case management system. So what happens is if a victim of trafficking is identified and returned to the state, the civil servants or social workers will go and visit the person and complete a needs assessment from that person to determine how can they be helped, what are their needs, how can we sort of help them reintegrate or prevent them from being trafficked again back into the same system. And what we've actually done is worked with them together to completely revise that needs assessment process and actually include the 12 core indicators of trafficking in there. And I think that that's quite important because number one, it can help us, it can help develop, a better understanding of what their experience has been, but also because this case management system is designed to sort of, collect information about people as they're rescued over time. What you can imagine is this is a sort of opportunity to collect data about the trends that are happening in trafficking according to that indicator structure that can be sort of compared to other countries and sort of cross-sectional surveys. And that will give us sort of this longer time series ongoing data collection that fits into sort of the indicator structure that can be comparable across different contexts and countries as well. Is this you, Jessie, or still me? Okay.
This was you, but I think you covered a lot of it.
I think I may have covered this, and I think we're also running out of time. So one of the potential limitations of our study is that because we're doing a household survey, which is of course necessary to collect sort of this, population representative estimate, we do feel that we possibly could miss transient workers. So these are workers that are maybe don't necessarily have a permanent home or who are just sort of perpetually migrating from work site to work site. I will, save you all from my terrible Portuguese and not try to pronounce this word that they have for that population in Brazil. We've heard about these populations, in particularly high-risk sectors like the charcoal sector, which is another sector that we're working on. And so I think that these people could be missed in our survey if they don't have a permanent home. They don't, have that home to return to or that household to belong to. So we're working in partnership with a survivor-led advocacy group, which sort of already engages with this community in order to do a follow-up survey where we are sort of taking a different approach, which will hopefully do a better job of identifying and collecting information from people, even if they don't have a permanent home.
Thanks, Kim. I'll take over these last two
slides.
Okay,
good. Like I said, I don't have slide numbers here, so.
Yeah, no, all good. Just to go over a few key sort of challenges and limitations that we faced. The first is sort of on ethics review. There's some logistical challenges, obviously to ethics review when you're working internationally on a sensitive topic like human trafficking. But what I really want to focus on is like the broader questions around safeguarding that this kind of research brings up. So, what you do, what responsibility you have if, you're identifying folks in real time who are currently being or have been victimized by human trafficking. And that's something where I feel like the field in general is working on, and we have ILO guidance now on this. And I believe IPA is working on some related to their HTRI. But I think this is still an area that obviously presents some ethical challenges. I think secondly, when you're going into a sector where surveys like this haven't been done in the past, you're always, going in a little bit blind with limited information on the population, to inform your study design. So as Kim mentioned, we learned more about sort of transient workers and had to make consideration for that. And then also, we discovered pretty quickly during the surveys that there was a higher proportion of folks working on family-owned farms than we might have anticipated. And so then that, forced us to think about what can exploitation look like on a family-owned farm or amongst, people that are quite familiar. For the purposes of this study, as Kim noted, we sort of had to just assume that there was not trafficking in these cases, but we know that it's a much more nuanced reality. And then lastly, I think just the broader challenges to implementing a method like NSUM amongst, to understand human trafficking estimation when you're using a multi-indicator method, because obviously if someone's reporting out on, their friend Anna, or this person that they know, Anna, we don't know for sure if when they report one given indicator, we don't know if that's occurring at the same time on the same job as another indicator that they report, to be able to add those up to calculate like, okay, that person was trafficked. So it's very challenging to implement NSUM with a multi-indicator design like this. And then our last slide is just to reiterate some of the points that Kim already raised around sort of the impact and value of this research. I think it's just worth underscoring sort of this line from our hopefully forthcoming manuscript around this work, which is that we found commonplace exploitation among agricultural workers, trafficked intermittently, working at local jobs found through potentially trusted networks. And I think this line really sort of captures the learnings that I think also maybe challenge some of our thoughts around what trafficking really looks like, and why it's hard to operate in a field where trafficking is this sort of binary yes or no phenomenon, when it's very much occurring sort of on a spectrum. And then Kim already sort of highlighted how this work is going to inform future work, hopefully in the charcoal sector, which brings in some of our other sort of satellite-based object detection technologies, which is very exciting. We're also exploring the potential incorporation of relevant questions that are sort of based on this survey into regularly enumerated national labor surveys in Brazil. So those are longitudinal surveys of about 200,000 households that are collected every 3 months. So that would obviously be very exciting as a way to track this data over time, which I think plays into that little matrix down there at the bottom that tries to highlight some of the advantages and limitations of different types of data collection and data that can be used to understand trafficking. So obviously we're not gonna be able to implement a prevalence survey like this every 3 months, but if we can sort of look at that data in light of administrative data that is collected regularly, that can be really illuminating to understand the phenomenon of trafficking. And then lastly, in terms of dissemination, we're working with our enumeration partners in Brazil to sort of plan presentation of findings for relevant Brazilian stakeholders, which we think is really important. And we've also actually been in discussions with another PRIF grantee about the best approaches to sharing results like this, being sensitive to the differences in legal definitions and sort of understanding of what trafficking looks like between, say, the US and Brazil in this case. And then in addition to the paper, the forthcoming paper just about this research, we're also incorporating these findings into a draft paper that really will look at the results in comparison with the data from the inspection reports and task force records, as well as the dirty list and information on social safety net program enrollment, to really get that fuller picture of what trafficking looks like in Brazil, and really flesh out the advantages and limitations of these different forms of data collection. So with that, thank you all for your attention, and we can turn over to Q&A. I know Grant is also with us, so maybe he'll come on for Q&A. Great to see you, Grant. And I know we have a few questions already there.
Thank you all for the great presentation. I'm Andre Gallant, the communications director, often in the background of these kinds of events. But what I can do is I'll run through the questions, and the panelists can respond at their leisure. Okay, well, to go to our first one that came in at the beginning of your presentation, which was trafficking data is always gathered on the basis of reported incidents, but the number of unreported cases is very big. How could we make a countering strategy in the absence of complete trafficking data?
Sorry, I don't see that question.
It was in the
answered one, because I typed
okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, Jessie, do you want to take this one?
So I think this plays into the point I tried to make at the end, which is, obviously the more that we can implement surveys like this and analyze administrative data to help us discover what those biases and limitations are, the better we will be able to understand what is and is not captured by those reported incidents. So work like this, I think, is really important to getting at your point, Shahid. Obviously, we're never going to have perfect information, but I think the bringing together of survey data with administrative data, with anecdotal information from partners on the ground is the best way to getting towards this point of how to design effective interventions.
Yeah, I'll echo what Jessie said and say that I think, especially within our lab, we tend to sort of have a very broad consideration of what we think about as trafficking data, and we rely a lot on administrative data for doing work that's sort of policy relevant or sort of relevant to the trafficking in different sectors, not just in agriculture in Brazil. And I think the key is what Jessie mentioned is like, no one source of data is going to be perfect. And so you can use these different sets of data and these different sources of data together in order to improve or sort of address some of the limitations. So for example, if you think about, there's 50,000 recorded cases of people who have been rescued from trafficking since the 90s in Brazil. And of course, as Jessie mentioned in the beginning, that body of cases is going to suffer from many unknown biases because these are just the cases that have been detected by law enforcement. And so we don't really know how that relates to truly prevalent cases. But if we can combine that with a study like ours of, sort of this more representative picture of trafficking in sort of, well, in our case, in agriculture in Brazil, we can start to understand the scale and the direction of those biases in detected cases and potentially think about making some adjustments when using detected cases to infer about the whole population.
So, Shahid, thank you for that question. I'm not going to chime in on everything. I agree with what Jessie and Kim said. I did want to add one other thing here that came up in the presentation too. We think a big opportunity in Brazil and potentially in other countries as well is piggybacking a subset of questions like we fielded in our survey on some of these standing surveys that many countries do to measure aspects of labor force or even unemployment. Many countries in Latin America do a quarterly survey to measure unemployment. These tend to be representative. You could imagine distilling a subset of questions from an instrument like ours to get fielded regularly there. I think that would be a profound contribution, honestly, and really open up a path for more work on, I guess I'm a broken record on this, but really studying what works and why, not just understanding prevalence. So it's necessary but not sufficient. And I think we really need more work on what works and why, and that would really set that up, I think, for your question.
Okay, great. Let's go to the next question. Does your team have any thoughts on the high percentage of local victims? Do you suspect acknowledging limitations that this finding would hold with a nationwide sample, or that it may be explained by the concentration of agricultural activity and vulnerabilities to trafficking in persons in northeastern Brazil?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we are only representative of the areas that, comprise our sample frame. So we're not going to claim that our study is representative of the experiences in like southern Brazil, for example. But so we can't really say. But I do think that the finding that there is such a high prevalence of these very exploitative practices being experienced by people in jobs that are close to home is quite policy relevant, regardless of whether, I think we don't necessarily need to know what is the exact prevalence everywhere in Brazil to understand, okay, this is quite a big problem. These are conditions that people are enduring, on a regular basis as, as part of a, sort of common accepted condition of doing agricultural work. And so how can we design policies to protect workers against those? So yeah, of course, we're not going to be representative of places that we didn't include in our survey or in our sample frame. And, that's a limitation of our study. But I do think that the finding has quite a lot of relevance to sort of social safety net policy, labor policy, and those kind of things. And also maybe has relevance for, you know, thinking about who qualifies for, you know, so Brazil has a social, a special unemployment benefit for people who are identified in trafficking situations. And so it provides benefits to people in order to sort of reestablish themselves or sort of, you know, find a different type of work and recover from the experience. And so this also could potentially have relevance for law enforcement in determining, you know, who gets that benefit and who is determined to be a victim of trafficking during these site inspections that happen, you know, all over the country.
Any additions there, Jessie or Grant? Okay.
No.
Are there any interventions recommended directed towards farm owners to reduce prevalence of trafficking?
So we haven't, you know, based on this particular research, we haven't sort of had an opportunity to have funded activity around designing interventions specific to these learnings, though we are working on a couple interventions in other sectors. So as I mentioned, working with GFEMS on a project in the coffee sector, specifically in Minas Gerais, as well as in the charcoal sector of Maranhão, as Kim highlighted in her remarks. So those are two areas where we're both, you know, undertaking research to understand the sector and participating in implementing an intervention, which we will then also evaluate. To Grant's point about the lab really wanting to also be focused on understanding what works and why. So those are two areas where we do have active interventions.
I'm going to contradict myself and add one thing on this too. I think an exciting area for work, and we're actually doing some right now in Bangladesh that I won't go into, is focusing on the concept of trying to find business aligned strategies. I'm not going to argue that those are always going to get the job done. But I think that, you know, full reliance on state capacity for regulation and enforcement also has its inadequacies. And so, although I'm not proposing anything specific right now, this is a very active area of work for us as well to try to find business aligned strategies that are not naive to the limits of that, but also try to leverage that in environments when sometimes there's not other immediate ways to reach certain workers.
I think we have time for one question. The next one in line is, in your experience working with the social work team, did you observe challenges in making contact or following up with victims?
Yeah, so I'm going to address that quite quickly. And if it's okay with you, I also do want to just speak a little bit on this NSUM question, because I think it is important for research in this field. Yes, it is really hard to make contact with victims after they are rescued from a case of trafficking. And in fact, that's a focus of our sort of follow-on interventions that we're working on in Maranhão. It is quite hard for social workers and civil servants to find people after they've sort of been rescued from trafficking, and we're actively working on ways to improve that process as well in Maranhão, and that's maybe for a follow-up learning series. But I did want to take time just to acknowledge this question about NSUM, because I think it is quite important for this field. NSUM is really hard to apply in a context where you have multiple indicators that have to be happening simultaneously for a person in order to sort of meet a sort of yes/no definition of trafficking or not trafficking. And there are many sources of bias when using NSUM that are challenging for any context, but in particular when you have sort of a complicated and poorly understood condition like trafficking, right? So it's not as easy as just sort of saying, do you know anybody that died in this earthquake? Yes or no? Then that's quite an easy sort of thing to determine for people in your network. You don't always know about everybody's full experiences. And even if you do know about everyone's full experiences, you may not always associate that with trafficking, right? So we'll probably, so we're working on another study, I think, that goes into this a little bit more deeply, which tries to address some of these issues. What we decided to do in our NSUM survey was to ask about the most common conditions of trafficking for people and focus on, sort of one question that applied to people in your network, as opposed to, okay, now of the people named Anna who experienced this, did that Anna also experience condition B or whatever, something like that. And what we hope to do is use the results of our NSUM, which sort of focus on these like the most common indicators, in combination with our more representative, sort of fuller survey, and sort of use the conditional probabilities of experiencing each of the other indicators conditional on experiencing that one indicator in order to do an adjustment. So I think we're going to call it like double scale up or something like that, but we're working on that paper. It's going to be more of a technical paper, but it will address some of the challenges of using NSUM in a context like this. Also, sorry, one more piece on NSUM that we did. I didn't mention it in the presentation, but because we were able to identify in real time people who met the definition of trafficking, we also asked those people who met the definition of trafficking a slightly different set of NSUM questions. We asked them about how much they talk about their experiences, how much did they share those experiences with the people in their network. So we will hopefully be able to use that to put some parameters around the transmission bias issue.
Very good. We've ended perfectly on time. And I guess on behalf of myself and my colleague Lydia Aletraris, I want to say thank you so much to Jessie Brunner, Kim Babiarz, and Grant Miller for their presentation today. It was very wonderful, insightful, and also thank you to all of the attendees for their wonderful questions. Just briefly, as always, we'll be posting a video recording of this presentation to YouTube. It'll be on the Centro website, that's centro.uga.edu, and will also be shared via email with attendees. We'll have slides, and of course, we'll be sharing the special issue of about the PRIF studies when it's finalized. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing everyone again at the next PRIF Learning Series, which hopefully will be in August. So take care and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.